The desert wind carried whispers of death across the Arizona Territory in the summer of 1877. Tales of the Apache Queen spread like wildfire through every saloon, trading post, and cavalry fort from Tucson to El Paso. Men spoke her name in hushed tones, their eyes darting to the horizon as if speaking too loudly might summon her warriors from the red rocks and thorny mesquite. She was known as Ayanna, though white men called her the Apache Queen. The stories painted her as a phantom of vengeance who led her band of warriors through impossible terrain, striking settlements and disappearing like smoke. What made the tales truly terrifying was the consistent detail that emerged from every survivor's account. No white man who fell into her hands ever lived to tell about it. The Arizona Territorial Gazette had printed dozens of accounts over the past 3 years. Wagon trains found burned to ash with no survivors. Mining camps discovered empty except for scattered bones bleaching in the desert sun. Trading posts reduced to charred timber and silence. In every case, witnesses described the same scene. Apache warriors led by a woman who moved like a desert spirit, her long black hair flowing behind her as she rode. Thomas Mackenzie had read every one of those newspaper accounts during his long journey west. The 28-year-old cowboy from Missouri carried the clippings folded in his saddlebags, studying them by firelight as he made his way toward the Arizona Territory. Unlike most men who avoided Apache country, Thomas was riding straight into it with purpose burning in his chest. His younger brother Samuel had been part of a surveying expedition that vanished 6 months earlier near the Dragoon Mountains. The official report listed all 12 men as missing, presumed dead. Thomas refused to accept that his brother was gone without proof. Samuel had always been too clever and too stubborn to die easily. If there was even a chance he was alive, Thomas would find him. The trail had grown cold by the time Thomas reached Tombstone. The dusty mining town buzzed with silver fever and gunfighter legends, but mention of the missing surveyors brought only shaking heads and sad looks. The local sheriff, a weathered man named Carson, pulled Thomas aside at the Oriental Saloon. "Son, I knew your brother," Carson said, his voice heavy with whiskey and regret. "Samuel was a good man, smart as a whip. But that expedition rode into Apache Queen territory. We found their camp 3 days after they were due back. Nothing left but ashes and vultures." Thomas gripped his beer mug tighter. "You find any bodies?" "Pieces here and there, enough to know what happened." Carson leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Listen to me, boy. Whatever you're thinking of doing, forget it. That Apache woman and her warriors, they don't take prisoners. They don't negotiate. They kill every white man they catch and they make it slow." But Thomas had made his decision before arriving in Tombstone. He spent 2 weeks gathering supplies and information, talking to every scout, prospector, and drifter who had survived encounters with Apache bands. The picture that emerged was both terrifying and fascinating. Ayanna was no ordinary war leader. Born to a prominent Apache family, she had learned warfare from her grandfather, one of the last great chiefs to resist the white man's advance. When her husband and 2 children were killed in a cavalry raid on their peaceful village, something inside her had transformed. She emerged from mourning as a force of nature, gathering warriors from different Apache bands who saw in her the spirit of resistance their people needed. Her tactics were unlike anything the army had encountered. She struck with perfect timing, seeming to know exactly when settlements were most vulnerable. Her warriors moved through impossible terrain, appearing and disappearing like ghosts. Most unnervingly, she seemed to understand her enemies better than they understood themselves. Thomas studied every detail he could gather about her methods and territory. The Apache Queen favored the rugged country around the Dragoon Mountains, where ancient volcanic formations created a maze of canyons and hidden valleys. Water was scarce but predictable if you knew the secret springs. Game was plentiful for those who understood the land's rhythms. On a scorching July morning, Thomas loaded his pack horse and rode out of Tombstone toward the Dragoons. He carried enough supplies for 2 weeks, a Winchester rifle, and a Colt .45 that had belonged to his father. More importantly, he carried something no other white man had brought into Apache territory: genuine respect for his enemies and a willingness to die trying to find his brother. The first 3 days passed without incident as Thomas followed cattle, trails, and game paths deeper into the mountains. The landscape was breathtaking and hostile in equal measure. Towering rock spires pierced the sky like ancient monuments. Hidden canyons opened suddenly beneath his horse's hooves. The silence was so complete it seemed to have weight. On the 4th morning, Thomas knew he was being watched. It was nothing he could point to specifically, just the crawling sensation between his shoulder blades that told him eyes were tracking his every move. His horse, a steady buckskin gelding named Charlie, began acting nervous, ears constantly swiveling and nostrils flaring at scents Thomas couldn't detect. That afternoon, the feeling intensified. Thomas began to notice small signs: a rock that seemed out of place, a patch of disturbed earth beside a waterhole, the way certain birds fell silent as he passed. Whoever was watching him was skilled beyond anything he had encountered, but they were definitely there. As the sun began to set, Thomas made a decision that would have seemed insane to anyone who knew the stories about the Apache Queen. Instead of making a defensive camp and preparing for attack, he deliberately rode into an open meadow surrounded by high walls of red rock. There was no cover, no escape route, and no tactical advantage whatsoever. He dismounted in the center of the meadow, unsaddled Charlie, and began building a fire. As flames began to lick at the dry wood, Thomas called out in a clear voice that echoed off the canyon walls. "I know you're watching me," he said. "I'm not here to fight. I'm looking for my brother Samuel Mackenzie. He was with a surveying party that came through here 6 months ago. I just want to know if he's alive." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Then, just as full darkness settled over the desert, Thomas heard the soft sound of unshod hooves on stone. He kept his hands visible and his weapons holstered as shapes began to emerge from the shadows around the meadow. The Apache warriors materialized from the darkness like spirits taking physical form. Thomas counted at least a dozen mounted figures positioned around the meadow's edge, their faces painted with war colors that made them appear more demon than human in the flickering firelight. Each warrior carried weapons that gleamed dully in the orange glow: rifles, war clubs, and the curved bows that could put an arrow through a man's heart at impossible distances. But it was the woman who commanded Thomas's attention as she rode into the circle of light. The Apache Queen sat her horse with the fluid grace of someone born in the saddle. She was smaller than the story suggested, but there was something in her bearing that filled the space around her with dangerous energy. Her long black hair was adorned with silver ornaments that caught the firelight, and her dark eyes held an intelligence that seemed to see straight through to a man's soul. Ayanna studied the white cowboy with the careful attention of a hunter, examining potentially dangerous prey. In all her years of warfare against the white invaders, no man had ever ridden deliberately into her territory and announced his presence so brazenly. The act was either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish, and she had learned that the difference between the two was often smaller than most people imagined. "You speak of looking for your brother," she said in English that carried only the slightest accent. Her voice was lower than Thomas had expected, with a musical quality that seemed at odds with her fearsome reputation. "Why do you think he might be alive when all the others died?" Thomas kept his hands visible and his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "Because Samuel is too stubborn to die easy and too smart to die stupid. If any man from that surveying party survived, it would be him." A warrior to Ayanna's left spoke rapidly in Apache, his tone clearly urging immediate action. Thomas caught enough of the conversation to understand that the warrior was advocating for killing the white man quickly and being done with it. But Ayanna raised her hand for silence, her eyes never leaving Thomas's face. "What makes you believe your brother lives when we left no survivors?" she asked. Thomas had prepared for this question during his long ride into the mountains. "Because I know my brother. Samuel speaks some Apache. He learned it from an old scout back in Missouri. He's also a doctor, trained in medicine before he became a surveyor. A man with those skills might be worth keeping alive." The Apache Queen's expression didn't change, but Thomas noticed several of the warriors exchange glances. He pressed his advantage carefully. "I'm not here to cause trouble or seek revenge," Thomas continued. I just want to know if Samuel is alive. If he is, maybe we can work out some kind of arrangement. If he's dead, I'll accept that and right away. Ayanna dismounted with fluid grace and walked closer to the fire. In the better light, Thomas could see that she was probably in her early 30s, with the kind of weathered beauty that came from a life lived entirely outdoors. Scars marked her hands and arms, evidence of countless battles and hardships. But it was her eyes that held him. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much death and carried the weight of her people's survival on her shoulders. You offer to make arrangements, she said. What could you possibly have that would interest me? Thomas had thought long and hard about this moment. Information, medical supplies, and maybe something more valuable, the truth about why your people and mine keep killing each other when we could probably help each other instead. One of the warriors made a sound of disgust and spoke sharply in Apache. Thomas caught enough to know the man was calling him a liar and a fool, but Ayanna silenced him with a sharp gesture. You think you understand something about my people, and yours? She asked. I think I understand that you're fighting a war you can't win, and my people are making the same mistakes they've made with every tribe they've encountered. Everybody's dying, nobody's winning, and the only people getting rich are the ones selling guns and supplies to both sides. Ayanna studied him for a long moment, then turned and spoke rapidly to her warriors in Apache. Thomas could only catch fragments, but he heard his name in what sounded like a heated discussion. Finally, she turned back to him. My warriors think I should kill you now and send your scalp back to Tombstone as a warning. They say you are either a spy or a fool, and both are dangerous. Thomas felt sweat running down his back despite the desert's evening chill. What do you think? I think you are probably both a spy and a fool, Ayanna replied. But you are also something I have not encountered before. You rode into my territory alone, knowing the stories about what happens to white men who do such things. You announced yourself instead of trying to hide, and you speak of your brother with the kind of loyalty that is rare among your people. She paused, her gaze shifting to the fire and then back to his face. Your brother Samuel is alive. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. Relief and fear warred in his chest as he processed what she had said. He's alive? Where is he? Can I see him? He lives, but not as you might expect, Ayanna said carefully. The surveying party was attacked because they were mapping water sources in sacred areas. My warriors were prepared to kill them all, as we have killed all the others. But your brother did something unexpected. She began walking slowly around the fire, her movements hypnotic in their fluid grace. When the shooting began, Samuel Mackenzie threw down his weapon and began treating wounded warriors, Apache warriors who had been shot by his own companions. He worked on my nephew who had taken a bullet in the leg. He saved the boy's life. Thomas felt his breath catch. That sounded exactly like something Samuel would do. His brother had always believed that a doctor's oath transcended everything else, including personal safety and political loyalty. So you spared him? I brought him back to our camp, Ayanna continued. He has been treating our sick and wounded for 6 months. He has learned our language, our customs. He has saved many lives. The Apache queen stopped walking and fixed Thomas, with a stare that seemed to burn right through him. But he is still a prisoner. He cannot leave, and he knows that any attempt to escape would mean death. He exists in a strange place between your world and mine, belonging fully to neither. Thomas felt a mixture of relief and worry. Samuel was alive, but trapped in a situation that could turn deadly at any moment. I want to see him. I want to talk to him. That may be possible, Ayanna said. But first, you must prove that you are worthy of such trust. My people have been betrayed by white men so many times that trust has become a luxury we cannot afford. She gestured to her warriors, who began moving closer to the fire. You will come with us to our camp. You will see how we live, what we face, why we fight. If you prove yourself worthy, you will see your brother. If you prove yourself false, you will die. But either way, you will learn the truth about the Apache queen and her people. Thomas nodded slowly. He had come this far on faith and determination. Now he would have to trust his life to a woman the entire territory considered a merciless killer. As the warriors began breaking camp around him, Thomas realized he was about to enter a world that no white man had ever seen and lived to describe. The stories all claimed that no white man survived contact with the Apache Queen. A few hours he would discover whether those stories were true, or whether there was more to the legend than anyone had imagined. The Apache camp nestled in a hidden canyon that Thomas never would have found without guidance. The entrance was barely wide enough for a single horse, concealed behind a curtain of hanging vines and fallen boulders that looked like random debris to untrained eyes. But once inside, the canyon opened into a natural fortress complete with running water, sheltered alcoves for sleeping, and defensive positions that would make any attacking force pay dearly for every foot of ground. Thomas counted roughly 60 people as they rode into the camp. Men, women, children, and elders moved about their evening routines with the easy efficiency of people who had learned to live with constant danger. Cooking fires sent thin streams of smoke toward the star-filled sky, carefully positioned to dissipate before reaching the canyon rim where they might be spotted by army patrols. What struck Thomas most forcefully was how normal it all seemed. These weren't the savage demons described in newspaper accounts. These were families trying to survive in an increasingly hostile world. Children played quiet games in the shadows while their mothers prepared evening meals. Old men sat together, their weathered hands working on weapons or tools while they spoke in low voices. Warriors tended to their horses and equipment with the careful attention of professionals who knew their lives depended on maintaining their gear. But Thomas also noticed the signs of a people under siege. Every adult carried weapons within easy reach. Sentries were posted at strategic points around the canyon. The children played quietly, trained from birth to avoid making sounds that might carry beyond the camp. This was a community that slept lightly and lived every day knowing it might be their last. Ayanna led Thomas to a large lodge constructed against the canyon wall. The structure blended natural rock formations with carefully woven branches and hide coverings, creating a shelter that was both substantial and nearly invisible from above. As they approached, a familiar figure emerged from the entrance. Samuel Mackenzie had changed dramatically in the 6 months since Thomas had last seen him. His sandy hair had grown long and was now adorned with small braids in the Apache style. His pale skin had been darkened by constant sun exposure, and he wore a mix of white man's clothing and Apache accessories. But it was his eyes that showed the most dramatic transformation. The easy confidence Thomas remembered had been replaced by something deeper and more cautious, the look of a man who had seen the world from an entirely different perspective. "Thomas?" Samuel's voice cracked with disbelief as he recognized his brother in the firelight. "Dear God, what are you doing here?" The brothers embraced fiercely, and Thomas felt 6 months of worry and fear drain away in that moment. Samuel was alive, apparently healthy, and seemed to be treated well by his captors. But as they separated, Thomas saw the complex mixture of emotions in his brother's eyes. Joy at seeing family, but also fear for what Thomas's presence might mean. "I came to find you," Thomas said simply. "The expedition was reported lost. Everyone assumed you were dead." Samuel glanced nervously at Ayanna, who was watching the reunion with unreadable eyes. "I am alive, but the situation is complicated. Very complicated." Ayanna gestured for both brothers to enter the lodge. The interior was larger than Thomas had expected, with a central fire pit surrounded by comfortable seating made from woven mats and buffalo robes. Medical supplies were neatly organized on wooden shelves, some recognizably manufactured items, others that appeared to be traditional Apache remedies. "Your brother has become valuable to my people," Ayanna said as they settled around the fire. "He has saved many lives and taught us much about white man's medicine. In return, we have taught him our ways of healing and living with the desert." Samuel nodded, his expression troubled. "When the surveying party was attacked, I made a choice to help the wounded rather than fight. It saved my life, but it also made me complicit in the deaths of men I had worked with for months. I've been wrestling with that decision ever since." Thomas studied his brother's face, seeing the toll that months of moral complexity had taken. "You did what you thought was right. You're a doctor. You took an oath to help people regardless of who they are. But those same people I saved have gone on to kill other white settlers. Samuel replied. Every life I save here potentially costs lives elsewhere. It's not as simple as taking care of wounded people in a hospital back east. Ayanna leaned forward, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. Your brother has learned what it means to live between two worlds. He understands now that there are no simple answers when peoples are at war. Thomas looked between his brother and the Apache Queen, beginning to understand the complexity of the situation. So what happens now? Can Samuel leave? Can he choose to go home? That is not a simple question, Ayanna replied. Your brother knows the location of this camp and others. He knows our numbers, our weapons, our plans. If he returns to the white settlements, that information could be used to destroy my people. Samuel spoke up, his voice heavy with the weight of impossible choices. But if I stay here permanently, I become complicit in every raid, every attack, every death. I've been trying to find a middle path, but I'm not sure one exists. Thomas absorbed this information, understanding now why the situation was so complicated. His brother wasn't just a prisoner. He was caught in a moral and practical dilemma with no clear resolution. Any choice he made would have consequences for innocent people on both sides. There might be another way, Thomas said slowly. What if we could find a solution that didn't require choosing sides? Ayanna's expression sharpened with interest. Explain. Thomas had been thinking about this possibility during his long ride into the mountains, but now he began to see how it might actually work. The Apache are fighting because they're being pushed off their traditional lands and their people are starving. The white settlers are fighting because they're afraid and they don't understand Apache customs or intentions. Both sides are dying, but neither is getting what they really need. He paused, organizing his thoughts. What if there was a way to establish some kind of understanding? Not a surrender from either side, but an agreement that allowed both peoples to coexist? One of Ayanna's warriors, who had been listening silently from the lodge entrance, spoke sharply in Apache. Thomas caught enough to know the man was expressing skepticism about any agreement with white men. Ayanna replied in Apache, then switched to English. Broken Bow reminds me that your government has made many treaties with Indian peoples. All have been broken when it became convenient for white men to break them. I'm not talking about government treaties, Thomas replied. I'm talking about something smaller, more personal. Local agreements between specific groups who are willing to honor them. Samuel looked intrigued. What did you have in mind? Thomas took a deep breath, knowing he was about to propose something that would sound insane to people on both sides of the conflict. What if we established a kind of neutral zone? A place where Apache and white settlers could meet safely to trade, share information, maybe even provide medical care to each other when needed? Ayanna studied him for a long moment. You are suggesting that natural enemies could become allies? I'm suggesting that people who understand each other are less likely to kill each other, Thomas replied. And I think Samuel could be the bridge that makes it possible. He understands both worlds now. He could help translate more than just languages. The lodge fell silent except for the crackling of the fire. Thomas could see that his words had struck something in both his brother and the Apache Queen. It was a desperate idea, probably doomed to failure, but it offered something neither side had possessed before. Hope for a solution that didn't end in the complete destruction of one people or the other. Finally, Ayanna spoke. This idea has merit, but it would require trust from people who have learned that trust equals death. It would require courage from warriors who have survived by being suspicious of everything, and it would require wisdom from leaders who are used to solving problems with violence. She stood and walked to the lodge entrance, gazing out at her people. But perhaps it is time to try a different kind of courage. The old ways of fighting are leading my people toward extinction. Maybe it is time to risk everything on the possibility of peace. The next morning brought the first real test of Thomas's radical proposal. A young Apache warrior named Running Wolf staggered into camp just after dawn, clutching a bullet wound in his shoulder and speaking urgently to anyone who would listen. The raiding party he had been part of had attacked a small ranch south of Tombstone, but the assault had gone wrong when Army cavalry arrived unexpectedly. 3 warriors were dead, 2 more were wounded and captured, and Running Wolf himself had barely escaped with his life. Thomas watched from beside Samuel's medical area as Ayanna gathered her war council to discuss the situation. The debate was intense, conducted in rapid Apache that Thomas could only partially follow, but the tone made the positions clear. Some warriors wanted immediate retaliation for their captured comrades, while others argued for caution given the increased military presence in the area. Samuel worked quietly on Running Wolf's shoulder wound, cleaning and dressing it with the skill of someone who had treated countless similar injuries over the past months. But Thomas noticed his brother's hands were shaking slightly as he worked, and there was something haunted in his expression. "This is what I live with every day," Samuel said quietly as he finished bandaging the wound. "I patch up warriors knowing they'll ride out again to kill more settlers, and if I refuse to treat them, they die, and probably take their anger out on other white prisoners or civilians." Thomas helped his brother pack away the medical supplies. "What about the captured warriors? What usually happens to Apache prisoners?" Samuel's expression darkened. "They're usually hanged after a brief military trial. Sometimes they're sent to prison camps in Florida, which is essentially a slower death sentence. The Army doesn't take many Apache prisoners alive." The implications hit Thomas immediately. If those captured warriors died, the entire camp would be consumed with rage and thoughts of revenge. Any possibility of establishing peaceful contact would vanish in the inevitable cycle of retaliation. But what if there was a way to intervene? That afternoon, Thomas requested a private meeting with Ayanna. They walked to a secluded part of the canyon where ancient pictographs decorated the rock walls, images of hunters and animals from a time when the desert was green and conflicts were simpler. "Those captured warriors," Thomas began. "What if we tried to negotiate their release?" Ayanna's laugh was bitter. "Negotiate with whom? The Army commanders who have standing orders to kill any Apache they encounter? The territorial officials who have placed bounties on Apache scalps? What about the rancher whose property was attacked? Sometimes civilians are more reasonable than military officers." Ayanna studied him with those penetrating dark eyes. "You would risk your life too, save Apache warriors you have never met?" Thomas considered the question seriously. "I'd risk my life to prove that there's another way to handle these situations. If we can show that negotiation works better than violence, maybe others will start to listen. And if you are killed or captured, what then? Your death would end. Any possibility of the peace you speak of? Then Samuel would have to carry on the idea," Thomas replied. "But doing nothing guarantees that more people on both sides will die. At least this way, we're trying something different." That evening, the War Council convened again. This time, Thomas was invited to participate. He sat beside Samuel in the eye circle of warriors, acutely aware that he was probably the first white man to ever witness such a gathering. The debate was fierce, with many warriors arguing that any attempt at negotiation was foolish and dangerous. Broken Bow, the warrior who had been most skeptical of Thomas from the beginning, stood to address the council. His Apache was too rapid and idiomatic for Thomas to follow completely, but Samuel provided a whispered translation. "He says you are either very brave or very stupid," Samuel murmured. "He thinks this is a trap, that you're trying to lure Apache warriors into the open, where they can be ambushed." Thomas waited until Broken Bow finished speaking, then asked Ayanna for permission to respond. She nodded, and he rose to address the council. "Broken Bow is right to be suspicious," Thomas said, speaking slowly so Samuel could translate. "Your people have been betrayed many times by white men who spoke of peace while preparing for war, but consider this. If I wanted to betray you, I could have brought soldiers to this hidden canyon. Instead, I came alone, armed only with hope and the desire to find my brother." He paused, looking around the circle at faces painted with war, colors and marked by years of conflict. "I'm not asking you to trust all white men. I'm asking you to trust me, and to let me prove that some white men can be trusted. If I fail, you lose nothing. If I succeed, you might save the lives of your captured warriors and take the first step toward a different kind of future." The debate continued for hours. Thomas and Samuel sat quietly while warriors argued passionately in Apache, their voices rising and falling like music. Finally, as the fire burned low, Ayanna called for silence. "We will try this thing," she announced, "but not as you suggest, Thomas Mackenzie. If you ride into Tombstone asking for the release of Apache prisoners, you will be laughed at or shot as a traitor. Instead, we will send you with something the white men value more than Apache lives." She gestured to one of the younger warriors, who brought forward a leather pouch. Ayanna opened it to reveal a handful of silver nuggets, each one the size of a man's thumb. "There is a silver mine in the sacred mountains," she said. "We have known of it for generations, but it means nothing to us. Silver cannot stop bullets or feed hungry children, but it drives white men to madness with greed." Thomas understood immediately. "You want me to trade silver for prisoners?" "I want you to offer them a choice," Ayanna replied. "They can hang 2 Apache warriors and gain nothing, or they can release them in exchange for information about silver deposits that could make them rich. Which do you think they will choose?" Samuel looked troubled. "Ayanna, that silver mine is in sacred territory. If white men learn about it, they'll flood the area with miners and destroy everything your people hold holy." The Apache Queen's smile was sad but determined. "My people are already being destroyed, Samuel. Our sacred places are already being violated. Perhaps it is time to use the white man's greed against itself." Thomas felt the weight of what was being proposed. He would be carrying information that could indeed save the captured warriors, but at the cost of accelerating the destruction of Apache lands. Yet if he refused, those men would certainly die, and the cycle of violence would continue. "There's another way to think about this," Thomas said slowly. "What if we use the silver information not just to trade for prisoners, but to establish the kind of neutral ground I was talking about? What if we propose a deal where Apache people get a percentage of any silver taken from their traditional lands?" Ayanna raised an eyebrow. "You think white men would agree to share their profits with Apache?" "I think some white men might, especially if the alternative is fighting a guerrilla war in mountains where they can't find the enemy," Thomas replied. "And if we can establish that principle with one mine, it might serve as a model for other agreements." The War Council erupted in discussion again, but Thomas could see that the idea had captured some imaginations. The notion of turning the white man's greed into a tool for Apache survival was audacious enough to appeal to warriors who had spent years fighting a losing battle against superior numbers and equipment. Finally, Ayanna stood. "You will ride to Tombstone tomorrow," she told Thomas. "You will attempt to negotiate the release of our warriors using the silver information as leverage, but you will not go alone." Thomas felt his heart skip. "You're coming with me?" "I am sending Running Wolf with you," she replied. "He knows the captured men personally and can verify their identities. Also, his presence will prove to the white authorities that you are negotiating with genuine Apache representatives." Thomas looked at Running Wolf, whose shoulder wound was still fresh and who would be riding into the heart of enemy territory. The young warrior met his gaze with steady eyes and nodded once. "This is either the beginning of something new," Samuel said quietly, "or it's going to get all of us killed." Ayanna smiled grimly. "Perhaps both," she said. "But at least we will die trying something different than what has failed us for so long." The ride to Tombstone felt like a journey between worlds. Thomas and Running Wolf traveled mostly in silence, each man lost in thoughts about what they were attempting. The young Apache warrior had painted over his war colors and wore a mixture of traditional and white man's clothing, but there was no disguising his heritage. His presence in Tombstone would either lend credibility to Thomas's mission or get them both killed before they could explain their purpose. As they approached the outskirts of town, Running Wolf spoke for the first time in hours. His English was accented but clear, learned during months of interrogating captured settlers and listening to his captors' conversations. "You know they will not believe you," he said. "White men think all Apache are savage animals who cannot be reasoned with." Thomas checked his weapons and the leather pouch containing the silver samples. "Then we'll have to show them something they understand better than reason. We'll show them profit." Tombstone buzzed with its usual chaotic energy as they rode down the main street. Silver miners, gamblers, prostitutes, and gunfighters mixed in a volatile stew of greed and violence, but their arrival didn't go unnoticed. Conversations stopped as people stared at the strange sight of a white cowboy riding beside an Apache warrior who should have been shooting him on sight. By the time they reached the sheriff's office, a crowd had gathered. Thomas heard mutters about Apache lover and traitor from the growing mob, but also questions about what could possibly bring such unlikely companions together. Sheriff Carson emerged from his office with his hand resting on his gun, his weathered face grim with suspicion. "Thomas Mackenzie," Carson said slowly. "I thought you were dead for sure when you rode off into Apache country. And you brought a friend." "This is Running Wolf," Thomas said, dismounting carefully while keeping his movements non-threatening. "He's here under a flag of truce to negotiate the release of 2 Apache prisoners taken in yesterday's raid." The crowd's murmur turned ugly at the mention of Apache prisoners. Someone shouted about hanging all the Red Devils while another voice called for burning them alive. Carson raised his hand for quiet, but Thomas could see the situation was volatile. "Those prisoners are military custody," Carson said. "They're being held at the fort pending trial. I don't have authority over them." "Then we need to speak with whoever does have that authority," Thomas replied. "We're prepared to offer valuable consideration for their release." "What kind of consideration could you possibly offer for the lives of murdering savages?" The voice belonged to James Patterson, a prominent mine owner who had lost several workers to Apache raids. Thomas pulled out one of the silver nuggets and held it up so the crowd could see it clearly. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as every eye focused on the chunk of precious metal gleaming in the afternoon sun. This came from an undiscovered silver lode. 3 days later, Thomas found himself riding toward a predetermined meeting point in the foothills of the Dragoon Mountains, accompanied by an unlikely procession. Behind him rode James Patterson and 2 of his most trusted foremen, their saddlebags, heavy with silver coins for the promised payment. Sheriff Carson had insisted on coming as a neutral observer, while Running Wolf served as guide and translator. The 2 Apache prisoners, weak from their captivity but alive, rode between the white men with their hands unbound as a show of good faith. The meeting location was a natural amphitheater, surrounded by red rocks, with multiple escape routes and clear sightlines in all directions. As they approached, Thomas spotted Apache warriors positioned on the surrounding heights, not hidden, but visible enough to remind everyone that the white men were completely outnumbered and at the mercy of their hosts. Ayanna emerged from behind, a boulder formation, mounted on her paint horse and flanked by a dozen warriors. She had dressed for the occasion in traditional Apache clothing decorated with silver ornaments, her long hair braided with eagle feathers that marked her status as a war leader. She looked every inch the Apache queen that white men feared in their nightmares, but Thomas could see the careful intelligence in her dark eyes as she assessed the scene. The 2 groups approached each other slowly, stopping when they were close, enough to talk without shouting. The released Apache prisoners urged their horses forward, speaking rapidly in their native language as they rejoined their people. Thomas saw tears in the eyes of several warriors as they welcomed their brothers home. Patterson dismounted and walked forward, his businessman's confidence somewhat shaken by the reality of negotiating face-to-face with the legendary Apache queen. "Ma'am," he said awkwardly, clearly unsure of proper protocol for addressing an enemy war leader. "You may call me Ayanna," she replied in perfect English. "I understand you wish to discuss the silver deposits in our traditional territory." Thomas had briefed Patterson on what to expect, but the mine owner still seemed startled by her eloquence and dignity. The newspaper accounts had painted her as a savage killer, not an intelligent leader capable of sophisticated negotiation. "Yes, ma'am, Ayanna," Patterson said. "We're prepared to honor the terms discussed in Tombstone, 10% of net profits, employment opportunities, and protection for your sacred sites." Ayanna studied him for a long moment. "Before we proceed, I want you to understand something about Apache law. When we make an agreement, it is binding not just on the individuals involved but on their families and their people. If you break this agreement, It will be considered an act of war against all Apache bands in this territory. Patterson swallowed, hard, but nodded. I understand. And if your people break the agreement by raiding my mining operations, then you will have the right to demand compensation or void the contract entirely, Ayanna replied. But understand that my control extends only to this band and our allies. I cannot speak for all Apache people, just as you cannot speak for all white men. Thomas appreciated the careful way she was defining the limits of the agreement. This wasn't meant to be a comprehensive peace treaty, but rather a limited partnership between specific groups who were willing to trust each other. The actual exchange of information took place with almost ceremonial formality. Thomas produced a detailed map showing the location of the silver lode, along with samples that demonstrated the quality and quantity of ore available. Patterson examined everything carefully, asking technical questions that demonstrated his expertise in mining operations. This is indeed a significant deposit, Patterson admitted. Large enough to support a major operation for years. Ayanna nodded. Our people have known of it for generations. We call it the place where the mountain bleeds silver tears. It has never been important to us because silver cannot feed our children or protect them from soldiers. It will be different now, Patterson said. This silver can buy food, supplies, even weapons if necessary. It can give your people economic independence, or it can bring more white men into our territory than we have ever seen before, Ayanna replied. That is the risk we are taking by sharing this knowledge. Samuel had been quiet throughout the exchange, but now he spoke up. Ayanna, what about the larger question? This agreement proves that cooperation is possible, but it's just one mining operation. What about establishing something more permanent? The Apache queen looked thoughtful. Your brother is thinking like a doctor, she said to Thomas. He wants to cure the disease, not just treat the symptoms. She dismounted and walked to a flat rock that could serve as a natural table. From her saddlebags, she produced a piece of tanned hide covered with symbols and markings. This is a map of all the Apache bands in this territory, she explained. Each group controls specific areas and has different relationships with white settlements. Some are more hostile than others. Some might be willing to consider agreements, like this one. Thomas studied the hide map, beginning to understand the complexity of what they were attempting. You're talking about a network of individual agreements, rather than one comprehensive treaty. Exactly, Ayanna said. The United States government makes treaties with Apache tribes as if we were all one people with one leader. But we are many different groups with different needs and different leaders. Any lasting peace must recognize that reality. Patterson looked intrigued. You're suggesting that each Apache band could negotiate separate mining agreements with different companies? I am suggesting that Apache leaders who prove they can be trusted partners might find white businessmen more willing to deal with them than white soldiers, Ayanna replied. Profit is a powerful motivator for peace. Sheriff Carson had been listening carefully to this exchange. Ma'am, what you're describing sounds like it could work, but it would require a fundamental change in how the territorial government deals with Apache peoples. Right now, the official policy is basically extermination or forced relocation. Ayanna's smile was grim. Sheriff Carson, your government's current policy is failing. Apache bands are still free, still fighting, still disrupting white settlement and economic development. Perhaps it is time for your leaders to consider policies that actually work. Thomas felt a surge of excitement as he realized they weren't just negotiating a mining agreement. They were potentially laying the groundwork for a completely new approach to Apache-white relations. Instead of viewing the conflict as a zero-sum, or that one side had to win, they were exploring the possibility of mutual benefit. There's something else to consider, Samuel added. I've been living with Ayanna's people for months, learning their medicine and their ways of dealing with the desert. There's knowledge here that could benefit white settlements. Things like finding water, treating diseases, surviving in harsh conditions. Patterson nodded enthusiastically. And Apache workers who understand the terrain could make mining operations much more efficient and safer. As the sun began to set, the two groups finalized their agreement with handshakes and formal declarations witnessed by all present. The Apache prisoners were officially released, The silver mine location was confirmed, and a schedule was established for beginning mining operations under the new partnership model. But Thomas knew that the real test would come in the weeks and months ahead. Could white miners work alongside Apache partners without the racial tensions exploding into violence? Could Apache warriors resist the temptation to raid mining equipment when the profits seemed slow in coming? Could leaders on both sides control their more extreme followers who preferred the simplicity of warfare to the complexity of cooperation? As they prepared to part ways, Ayanna approached Thomas for a private conversation. "Your brother will be staying with us for now," she said. "Not as a prisoner, but as a bridge between our worlds. He understands both sides now, and we will need that understanding in the difficult times ahead." Thomas nodded, realizing that Samuel had found his true calling in this strange border between civilizations. "And what about me? Where do I fit in this new arrangement?" Ayanna studied him with those penetrating dark eyes. "You will return to Tombstone and help Patterson establish the mining operation. But more importantly, you will tell other white men what you have learned here. You will spread the word that the Apache Queen and her people are willing to share their land with those who approach them with respect instead of hatred." As Thomas rode back toward Tombstone, he reflected on the extraordinary events of the past week. He had come into Apache territory expecting to find his brother's grave. Instead, he had helped negotiate the first peaceful agreement between Apache and white interests in the territory's history. The stories all claimed that no white man survived contact with the Apache Queen, but Thomas had done more than survive. He had discovered that behind the fearsome reputation was a brilliant leader trying to find a way for her people to adapt and survive in a changing world.